In the autumn of 1665, when London's cobblestones ran slick with rain and whispered secrets, Lady Eleanor Whitmore believed herself abandoned by the one man she had dared to love. The Duke of Ravenshollow had thrust a leather purse heavy with gold into her trembling hands, his steel-grey eyes cold as winter frost. "Leave London tonight," he commanded, his voice devoid of the tenderness she once knew. "Never return." Beat. What Eleanor could not fathom was that beneath his cruel facade lay a desperate act of salvation, for the Duke harboured knowledge of a coming darkness that would soon consume the very streets she walked. If you're listening to this story, don't forget to click the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments which part of the world you're listening from. I want to know how far this story has travelled. The morning mist clung to the windows of Whitmore House like ghostly fingers, obscuring the bustling streets of London beyond. Lady Eleanor Whitmore pressed her palm against the cool glass, watching the world awaken while she remained trapped within walls of silk and propriety. At 22, she possessed the ethereal beauty that poets penned verses about. Auburn hair that caught fire in candlelight, emerald eyes that sparkled with intelligence, and a spirit that yearned for something beyond the gilded prison of her birthright. "Eleanor, step away from that window." Her mother's voice cut through the morning stillness like a blade through velvet. Lady Margaret Whitmore swept into the drawing-room, her burgundy gown rustling with authority. "A lady does not gawk at common folk like some tavern wench." Eleanor's fingers curled against the glass. "I was merely observing the morning, Mother. Surely there is no harm in—" "There is harm in everything you do that deviates from your purpose," Lady Margaret interrupted, her steel-blue eyes narrowing. "Have you forgotten? Tonight, the Duke of Ravenshollow dines with us. Your future depends upon making a favourable impression." The Duke of Ravenshollow. Even his name sent conflicting emotions coursing through Eleanor's veins. Adrian Blackwood, the most powerful man in England after the King himself, commanded respect and fear in equal measure. His vast estates stretched across 3 counties. His influence reached into Parliament's highest chambers, and his wealth could purchase kingdoms. Yet beneath his formidable reputation, Eleanor had glimpsed something else during their brief encounters at court. A loneliness that mirrored her own, an intelligence that sparked when their eyes met across crowded ballrooms. "I understand my duty, Mother," Eleanor replied, though her heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird. Lady Margaret's expression softened marginally. "This marriage will elevate our family beyond measure, child. The Whitmores have served the crown faithfully for generations, but we have never possessed true power. The Duke's proposal is a gift from Providence itself." Eleanor nodded dutifully, though privately she wondered if Providence truly intended for hearts to be bartered like commodities at market. She had spent countless nights dreaming of a different life, one where she might choose her own path, perhaps even find love that bloomed naturally rather than being arranged like flowers in a vase. The grandfather clock in the corner chimed 10 times, its deep resonance echoing through the house. Soon, the servants would begin preparations for the evening's dinner, polishing silver until it gleamed like starlight and arranging hothouse roses in crystal vases. Eleanor's lady's maid would spend hours arranging her hair into an elaborate coiffure, pinching her cheeks until they bloomed with colour, and lacing her into a gown designed to showcase her as a prize worthy of a duke's attention. "I shall retire to prepare," Eleanor murmured, curtsying slightly before gliding toward the door. "Eleanor," her mother called softly. When Eleanor turned, she saw something almost resembling tenderness in Lady Margaret's eyes. "The Duke is a good man, despite what society whispers about his stern nature. You could find happiness with him if you allow yourself to try." Eleanor's throat tightened. "And if I cannot?" Lady Margaret's mask of maternal concern slipped, revealing the calculating woman beneath. "Then you will learn to pretend, as every lady must. Happiness is a luxury, my dear. Security is a necessity." As Eleanor climbed the sweeping staircase to her chambers, her mother's words echoed in her mind: security over happiness, duty over desire. It was the anthem of her class, the price of privilege. Yet as she paused at her bedroom door, Eleanor found herself wondering what the Duke truly thought of their arrangement. Did he too feel the weight of expectation crushing his spirit? Or had years of wielding power taught him to view marriage as merely another transaction to be completed? The afternoon passed in a blur of preparation. Eleanor's maid, Sweet Mary, chattered nervously as she worked, her hands trembling slightly as she arranged Eleanor's hair. "His Grace is said to be the most handsome gentleman in all of England, my lady," Mary whispered conspiratorially, "though they do say he's got a temper fierce as a winter storm." Eleanor caught Mary's eye in the looking-glass. "What else do they say?" Mary's cheeks flushed pink. "Oh, my lady, I shouldn't repeat servants' gossip." "Please, Mary, I would know what manner of man I am to marry." Mary glanced toward the door, then leaned closer. "They say he's never loved a woman, my lady, that his heart is made of stone, cold as his castle up north, but—" She hesitated, biting her lower lip. "But what?" "But Mrs. Henderson, who works in his London house, she says she's seen him staring out his study window for hours, like he's searching for something he's lost, and once she found him reading poetry by candlelight, though he pretended to be reviewing ledgers when she entered." Eleanor's pulse quickened. Poetry, the image of the formidable Duke reading verses by flickering flame, seemed impossibly romantic, at odds with his reputation for cold calculation. Perhaps there was more to Adrian Blackwood than society knew. Perhaps beneath his armor of authority beat a heart capable of tenderness. As evening approached, Eleanor stood before her mirror, transformed into a vision of aristocratic perfection. Her gown of midnight blue silk complemented her eyes, while diamonds at her throat caught the light like captured stars. She looked every inch the future Duchess. Yet inside, she felt like a child playing dress-up in her mother's clothes. The sound of carriage wheels on cobblestones announced the Duke's arrival. Eleanor's breath caught as she heard his deep voice greeting her father in the entrance hall below. Soon, she would descend those stairs and step into her destiny. But as she placed her hand on the banister, Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that tonight would change everything in ways she could never imagine. What secrets lay hidden behind the Duke's steel-grey eyes, and would Eleanor discover them before it was too late? The dining room of Whitmore House had been transformed into a stage worthy of royalty. Crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across walls adorned with ancestral portraits, their painted eyes seeming to watch as history unfolded below. Eleanor descended the grand staircase with practiced grace, her silk gown whispering secrets with each step. At the bottom, 3 figures awaited her arrival, like players in a carefully orchestrated drama. Her father, Lord Charles Whitmore, stood resplendent in his finest evening wear, his chest puffed with pride at the advantageous match he had secured. Beside him, Lady Margaret's smile gleamed as brilliantly as the family diamonds adorning her throat. But it was the third figure that commanded Eleanor's attention completely. Adrian Blackwood, Duke of Ravenshollow, cut an imposing figure in his midnight black evening coat. At 30, he possessed the kind of masculine beauty that made women forget their manners and men question their own worth. His dark hair was swept back from a face carved by angels and hardened by experience, while those legendary steel-grey eyes seemed to pierce straight through to one's soul. When he bowed over Eleanor's gloved hand, his lips barely brushing her knuckles, she felt a tremor of something dangerous and electric. "Lady Eleanor," his voice was velvet over steel, cultured and commanding. "You look radiant this evening." "Your Grace honors me," Eleanor replied, proud that her voice remained steady despite the thundering of her heart. As they proceeded to the dining room, Eleanor caught the Duke studying her with an intensity that made her skin flush warm. There was something in his gaze, not the cold calculation she had expected, but rather a searching quality, as if he were trying to solve some complex puzzle. When their eyes met, she glimpsed a flicker of what might have been regret before his aristocratic mask slipped back into place. The dinner conversation flowed like fine wine, touching upon politics, literature, and the latest court gossip. Eleanor found herself genuinely engaged, surprised by the Duke's wit and the breadth of his knowledge. When she quoted Donne's poetry, his eyes lit with genuine appreciation. When she offered her thoughts on the recent tensions with France, he listened with the respect typically reserved for male peers. "You have an uncommonly sharp mind, Lady Eleanor," the Duke observed as the servants cleared the soup course. "Tell me, what are your thoughts on the new scientific discoveries being discussed at the Royal Society?" Eleanor's pulse quickened with excitement. Few men bothered to ask her opinion on such matters. "I find Mr. Hooke's work with microscopy fascinating, Your Grace. To think that entire worlds exist beyond what our eyes can perceive." "Indeed." Adrian leaned forward slightly, his attention completely focused on her. "I have recently acquired one of his instruments. Perhaps you would enjoy examining some specimens." The invitation hung in the air like a promise, intimate and thrilling. Eleanor felt her cheeks warm under his intense gaze. "I would be honored, Your Grace." Lady Margaret cleared her throat delicately. "How wonderful that you share such intellectual pursuits. A meeting of minds is surely the foundation of any successful union." The word union seemed to cast a shadow over the table. Eleanor watched as something shifted in the Duke's expression, a subtle hardening around his eyes. He reached for his wineglass with movements that seemed suddenly mechanical. "Indeed," he replied, his voice now carefully neutral. "A successful arrangement requires many considerations." Arrangement. The word stung more than Eleanor cared to admit. She had begun to hope that perhaps their marriage might bloom into something genuine, but his clinical terminology reminded her that this was, at its heart, a business transaction. As the evening progressed, Eleanor noticed subtle changes in the Duke's demeanor. He became increasingly distant, his responses growing shorter, his smiles failing to reach his eyes. When her father began discussing dowry arrangements and property settlements, Adrian's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "The Whitmore estates in Yorkshire border your northern holdings," Lord Charles was saying, spreading documents across the table with the enthusiasm of a merchant closing a profitable deal. "The marriage would consolidate a significant portion of the region under your influence." "Quite strategic," Adrian murmured, but Eleanor caught the distaste that flickered across his features. The final course arrived, delicate syllabub garnished with crystallized violets, but Eleanor found her appetite had vanished. The Duke's withdrawal felt like winter settling over what had promised to be spring. She watched him push the dessert around his plate, his thoughts clearly elsewhere. "Your Grace," she ventured softly, "have I said something to displease you?" His head snapped up, those grey eyes focusing on her with startling intensity. For a moment she saw something raw and unguarded in his expression, pain perhaps, or longing, but it vanished so quickly she wondered if she had imagined it. "Not at all, Lady Eleanor. You have been everything a gentleman could desire in a bride." The formal distance in his tone felt like a physical blow. Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as she set down her spoon, the delicate crystal ringing against the porcelain bowl. As the evening drew to a close, the Duke rose from his chair with fluid grace. "Lord Whitmore, Lady Margaret, I thank you for your gracious hospitality." He turned to Eleanor, executing a perfect bow. "Lady Eleanor, it has been illuminating." Eleanor curtsied, confusion and hurt warring in her chest. "The pleasure was mine, Your Grace." "Jai," but as Adrian straightened, she caught something in his expression that made her breath catch. A look of such profound sorrow that it seemed to echo from the depths of his soul. Before she could analyze it further, he had turned away. "I shall call upon you tomorrow evening," he announced to her parents. "There are matters we must discuss regarding the betrothal arrangements." After the Duke's departure, Eleanor excused herself and fled to her chambers, her mind reeling with questions. Mary helped her out of her elaborate gown, chattering excitedly about how handsome his Grace had looked, but Eleanor barely heard her. She dismissed the maid early and stood before her window in her nightgown, staring out at the gaslit streets of London. What had changed during dinner? One moment, the Duke had seemed genuinely interested in her thoughts and opinions, his attention making her feel truly seen for perhaps the first time in her life. The next, he had retreated behind walls of aristocratic formality, treating her like a beautiful object to be acquired rather than a woman to be cherished. The following evening arrived with unseasonable warmth for October, as if nature herself were holding her breath. Eleanor dressed carefully in a gown of pale green silk that complemented her eyes, hoping to recapture whatever spark had briefly ignited between them. But when the Duke arrived, he seemed like a different man entirely. Gone was any trace of the warmth she had glimpsed the night before. Adrian Blackwood stood in her father's study, like a statue carved from marble, his expression remote and unreadable. Eleanor's parents flanked him, their faces glowing with anticipation of the formal betrothal announcement. "Lady Eleanor," the Duke began, his voice carrying the weight of ceremony, "I have given considerable thought to our proposed union." Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs. Something in his tone warned her that whatever came next would shatter her world. "While you are undoubtedly a woman of exceptional beauty and accomplishment," Adrian continued, each word falling like stones into still water, "I find that we would not suit." The silence that followed was deafening. Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face as the meaning of his words sank in. He was rejecting her, publicly, formally, in front of her parents. "Your Grace," Lord Charles sputtered, his face flushing purple with shock and rage, "surely you cannot mean—" "I mean exactly what I have said." Adrian's voice cut through her father's protests like a blade. "Lady Eleanor deserves a husband who can offer her the devotion she merits. I am not that man." Eleanor found her voice at last, though it emerged as barely more than a whisper. "Have I done something to offend you, Your Grace?" For the briefest moment, Adrian's composure cracked, and she saw anguish flash across his features, but it was gone so quickly she might have imagined it. "You have done nothing wrong, Lady Eleanor. The fault lies entirely with me." He reached into his coat and withdrew a leather purse heavy with gold coins. "Please accept this as compensation for any inconvenience my change of heart may have caused." The purse landed on her father's desk with a dull thud that seemed to echo through Eleanor's very soul. Payment. He was paying her off like a dismissed servant. Lady Margaret gasped audibly, her hand flying to her throat. "Your Grace, this is highly irregular. Nevertheless, it is my decision." Adrian's tone brooked no argument. He turned to Eleanor one final time, and she could have sworn she saw his hands tremble slightly. "I wish you every happiness, Lady Eleanor. You deserve nothing less." With that he strode from the room, leaving Eleanor standing amid the wreckage of her future. The sound of his carriage wheels on cobblestones seemed to mock her as he disappeared into the London night. The aftermath was swift and brutal. Within hours, news of the Duke's rejection had spread through London's social circles like wildfire. Eleanor became the subject of whispered conversations and pitying glances. Some speculated about hidden scandals, others about secret inadequacies. The woman who had been the envy of every unmarried lady in England was now an object of curiosity and gossip. Her mother took to her bed with a case of nervous vapours, while her father raged about damaged reputations and lost opportunities. Eleanor bore it all with outward dignity, but inside she felt as though something vital had been torn from her chest. 3 days after the rejection, as Eleanor sat in her morning room, trying to lose herself in a book of poetry, Mary burst in with tears streaming down her face. "Oh, my lady," the maid sobbed, "I've just heard the most dreadful news from the market." Eleanor set aside her book, alarmed by Mary's distress. "What is it? What's happened?" "It's the plague, my lady," Mary whispered, as if speaking the word too loudly might summon the disease itself. "They say it's already claimed dozens of lives in the poorer districts. The physicians are saying it could spread throughout the city within weeks." Eleanor's blood turned to ice. The plague, the same disease that had devastated London decades before, claiming thousands of lives without regard for rank or station. If Mary's information was correct, then everyone in the city was in mortal danger. But as the full implications sank in, a terrible thought began to form in Eleanor's mind. The Duke's sudden rejection, his insistence that she deserved better, the way he had looked at her with such profound sadness. What if it hadn't been about her at all? What if Adrian Blackwood had known something that she did not? What if his cruel rejection had actually been an act of desperate love, designed to drive her away from a city doomed to become a charnel house? The revelation struck Eleanor like lightning, illuminating a storm-darkened sky. As Mary's words about the plague echoed in her mind, fragments of the Duke's behavior began forming a terrible, beautiful pattern. His sudden coldness, the anguish she had glimpsed behind his steel-grey eyes, the way he had pressed that heavy purse into her hands, not as payment for her humiliation, but as provision for her survival. "Mary," Eleanor said urgently, grasping her maid's trembling hands, "when did the physicians first suspect the plague had returned?" Mary wiped her eyes with her apron. "Mrs. Henderson from the Duke's household mentioned it 3 days past, my lady. She said His Grace had been meeting with court physicians and members of the Royal College in secret. They've been trying to keep it quiet to prevent panic, but 3 days passed. The very day before the Duke had dined with her family, before he had looked into her eyes with such tender attention, before he had withdrawn behind walls of ice and shattered her heart to save her life." Eleanor's breath came in short gasps as the full magnitude of his sacrifice became clear. Adrian Blackwood, the most powerful man in England, had destroyed his own reputation and hers to ensure she would flee London before the plague could claim her. He had made himself appear cruel and capricious, knowing that society would blame him rather than her for the broken betrothal. "Pack my things immediately," Eleanor commanded, rising with sudden purpose. "Only the essentials. We leave for Aunt Agatha's estate within the hour." Mary's eyes widened. "But my lady, your parents, will understand when they learn the truth." Eleanor was already moving toward her writing desk, her mind racing with plans. "Send word to the stables to prepare the fastest carriage. And Mary, tell no one of our true destination." Lady Agatha Pemberton, Eleanor's father's sister, had always been the family's most scandalous member. Widowed young and left with a substantial fortune, she had chosen to live independently in the countryside near Bath, surrounding herself with artists, writers, and free-thinking intellectuals rather than remarrying as society expected. Eleanor's parents tolerated Agatha's eccentricities because her late husband's wealth made her too valuable to alienate completely. The journey to Pemberton Manor took 2 days through autumn countryside painted in shades of gold and crimson. As London's smoke-stained skyline disappeared behind them, Eleanor felt as though she were shedding an old skin. The weight of expectation, the suffocating rules of society, the constant performance of perfection, all of it fell away with each mile that passed beneath their carriage wheels. Pemberton Manor emerged from the morning mist like something from a fairy tale. Unlike the formal grandeur of London's great houses, Agatha's home sprawled organically across rolling hills, its honey-coloured stone walls covered in ivy that blazed scarlet in the autumn light. Gardens that would have horrified Eleanor's mother with their wild profusion of flowers and herbs surrounded the house, while peacocks strutted across lawns where sheep grazed freely. Lady Agatha herself appeared at the front door before Eleanor's carriage had fully stopped, her silver hair flowing loose around her shoulders in a style that would have caused apoplexy among London's matrons. At 55, she possessed the kind of unconventional beauty that came from living life on her own terms. Laugh lines around intelligent hazel eyes, sun-touched skin that spoke of hours spent in her gardens, and an energy that seemed to crackle in the air around her. "Eleanor, my darling girl!" Agatha swept her niece into an embrace that smelled of lavender and paint. What a delightful surprise, though I suspect this visit is not entirely social given the shadows under your eyes. Within hours, Eleanor found herself ensconced in Agatha's cosy sitting room, a cup of chamomile tea warming her hands as she poured out the entire story. Her aunt listened without interruption, her expression growing more thoughtful with each revelation. "So the Duke sacrificed his reputation to save your life," Agatha mused when Eleanor finished. "How perfectly romantic and utterly foolish of him." Eleanor blinked in surprise. "Foolish? My dear child, the man clearly adores you, yet he chose martyrdom over honesty. A simple conversation about the plague would have achieved the same result without breaking both your hearts." Agatha set down her teacup with a decisive clink. "Men, even the most powerful ones, can be remarkably stupid when it comes to matters of the heart." "But surely he had no choice," Eleanor protested. "If he had told me the truth, I might have refused to leave, or word might have leaked and caused panic." "Nonsense!" Agatha waved a dismissive hand. "He could have found a dozen ways to ensure your safety without destroying your reputation. No, this grand gesture was as much about his own guilt and self-punishment as it was about protecting you. Mark my words. That man is torturing himself even now, believing he's done the noble thing." Eleanor felt a flutter of something that might have been hope. "Then you think he truly cares for me?" "Cares for you?" Agatha laughed, a sound like silver bells. "My dear girl, the man is obviously besotted. The question is, what do you intend to do about it?" The days that followed passed in a blur of new experiences that gradually began to heal Eleanor's wounded spirit. Agatha's household operated unlike any Eleanor had ever known. Breakfast was served whenever people wandered down. Conversations ranged from philosophy to politics without regard for what was considered appropriate for ladies. And the library was filled with books that would have been banned from most respectable homes. Eleanor met Agatha's circle of friends, a collection of artists, writers, and intellectuals who treated her not as a duke's rejected bride, but as an intelligent woman with opinions worth hearing. There was Mrs. Cordelia Ashworth, a novelist who wrote under a male pseudonym and spoke passionately about women's education. Mr. Benjamin Fletcher, a landscape painter whose canvases captured the wild beauty of the countryside with breathtaking skill. And Dr. Marcus Thornfield, a physician and natural philosopher who had studied at Edinburgh and spoke of revolutionary ideas about disease and healing. It was Dr. Thornfield who first mentioned the mysterious gentleman who had recently taken residence at nearby Blackwood Lodge. "Curious fellow," the doctor mused one evening as they sat around Agatha's drawing-room fire. "Arrived about a week ago with minimal staff and no fanfare. The locals say he's some sort of scholar, though he keeps very much to himself." Eleanor's pulse quickened at the mention of Blackwood Lodge. Surely the name was mere coincidence. "What manner of scholar?" she asked, trying to keep her voice casual. "Natural philosophy, from what I can gather. He's been purchasing scientific instruments and books on medicine. Mrs. Hartwell at the village shop says he's particularly interested in texts about plague and contagion." Dr. Thornfield adjusted his spectacles thoughtfully. "Rather timely, given the rumours coming out of London." Eleanor's teacup rattled against its saucer as her hands began to tremble. Could it be possible? Had Adrian followed her to the countryside, or was this merely another cruel coincidence? "Perhaps we should call upon this mysterious scholar," Agatha suggested with a knowing glint in her eye. "It's only neighbourly after all." "Oh, I don't think—" Eleanor began, but her aunt cut her off with a wave. "Nonsense. Tomorrow afternoon we shall pay a social visit to Blackwood Lodge. I'm quite curious about this reclusive gentleman myself." That night, Eleanor lay awake staring at the ceiling of her comfortable guest chamber, her mind spinning with possibilities. If the mysterious resident of Blackwood Lodge was indeed Adrian, what would she say to him? How could she face the man who had broken her heart to save her life? And more importantly, what did his presence here mean? The next afternoon arrived grey and drizzling, with mist clinging to the hills like ghostly veils. Eleanor dressed carefully in a walking dress of deep blue wool, her hands shaking slightly as Mary arranged her hair in a simple but elegant style. Agatha appeared in her own version of appropriate calling attire, a burgundy velvet coat that had probably been fashionable 20 years ago, but suited her unconventional beauty perfectly. Blackwood Lodge sat nestled in a valley about 3 miles from Pemberton Manor, its dark stone walls rising from gardens that had been allowed to grow wild. Smoke curled from several chimneys, suggesting the residence was indeed occupied, but the windows remained shuttered against the grey afternoon. As their carriage approached the front entrance, Eleanor's heart hammered so violently she feared it might burst from her chest. A single manservant answered their knock, a thin, nervous fellow who seemed surprised by the unexpected visitors. "Lady Pemberton and Lady Eleanor Whitmore to see the master of the house," Agatha announced, with the confidence of someone accustomed to being admitted wherever she chose to go. The servant's eyes widened at Eleanor's name, confirming her suspicions. That is, His Grace is not receiving visitors at present. His Grace. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. It was him. Adrian was here, hiding away in this remote lodge like some wounded animal retreating to lick its wounds. "Nonsense," Agatha declared briskly. "We're neighbours, not strangers. Surely His Grace can spare a few moments for common courtesy." Before the servant could protest further, a familiar voice echoed from the depths of the house. "Who is it, Morrison?" Eleanor's knees nearly buckled at the sound of Adrian's voice, rougher than she remembered, tinged with exhaustion and something that might have been despair. "Lady Pemberton and Lady Eleanor Whitmore, Your Grace," Morrison called back, his voice cracking slightly. The silence that followed seemed to stretch for eternity. Eleanor could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears, could feel Agatha's supportive presence beside her, could smell the damp earth and dying roses from the neglected gardens. Then footsteps approached, slow, measured, reluctant. Eleanor held her breath as the door swung wider, revealing the man who had haunted her dreams for weeks. Adrian Blackwood stood before them transformed. Gone was the immaculate Duke who had commanded every room he entered. This man wore a simple white shirt open at the throat, dark trousers that had seen better days, and an expression of such profound shock that Eleanor felt her heart crack anew. His dark hair was dishevelled as if he had been running his hands through it, and shadows under his grey eyes spoke of sleepless nights and endless torment. "Eleanor," he breathed, her name falling from his lips like a prayer and a curse combined. For a moment they simply stared at each other across the threshold, two souls recognizing their other half, despite all the pain that lay between them. Eleanor saw the exact moment when his shock transformed into anguish, when he realized that his sacrifice had been discovered and his noble gesture laid bare. "Your Grace," Eleanor managed, proud that her voice remained steady despite the chaos in her heart. "What an unexpected pleasure to find you in our neighborhood." But what secrets was Adrian still hiding, and would Eleanor have the courage to demand the truth this time? The tension in the doorway stretched taut as a bowstring, with Adrian's grey eyes searching Eleanor's face as if trying to memorize every detail. His hands gripped the doorframe so tightly his knuckles had turned white, and Eleanor could see the war raging behind his carefully controlled expression, the desire to pull her into his arms, battling against his conviction that he had no right to her presence. "Lady Pemberton," Adrian said finally, his voice hoarse with emotion as he executed a stiff bow. "Lady Eleanor, this is most unexpected." Agatha stepped forward with the confidence of a woman who had spent decades navigating society's complexities. "Your Grace, how delightful to discover we have such distinguished company in our quiet corner of the countryside. Surely you won't leave us standing on your doorstep like common peddlers." Adrian's composure cracked slightly, and Eleanor caught a glimpse of the man beneath the Duke's mask, vulnerable, exhausted, and desperately lonely. "Of course not. Please do come in." Indeed, the interior of Blackwood Lodge reflected its master's current state of mind. What should have been a gentleman's comfortable retreat bore the hallmarks of a man in exile. Books lay scattered across every surface, scientific instruments cluttered the drawing-room tables, and papers covered in Adrian's precise handwriting were pinned to the walls like the obsessive work of a madman. The air smelled of ink, parchment, and the lingering smoke of countless sleepless nights spent by candlelight. "I apologize for the disorder," Adrian said, hastily clearing papers from chairs so his guests could sit. "I have been occupied with research." Eleanor's eyes swept over the chaos, taking in medical texts, maps of London marked with red ink, and what appeared to be correspondence with physicians. Her heart clenched as she realized the full extent of his torment. He had not simply fled to the countryside to escape the consequences of his actions, but had thrown himself into studying the very plague he had tried to save her from. "Research into what, Your Grace?" Agatha inquired with innocent curiosity, though Eleanor caught the shrewd intelligence in her aunt's eyes. Adrian's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Natural philosophy. The behavior of diseases, their patterns of transmission." He gestured vaguely at the scattered papers. "Merely academic interest." "How fascinating," Eleanor said softly, her voice carrying a weight that made Adrian's head snap toward her. "And what have your studies revealed about the current situation in London?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a pistol shot. Adrian's face went pale, and Eleanor saw his hands tremble slightly before he clasped them behind his back. For a long moment he simply stared at her, and she could see him weighing his options, continue the charade or finally tell her the truth. "The situation in London," he repeated slowly, "is grave." "How grave?" Eleanor pressed, rising from her chair and taking a step toward him. "Grave enough to drive a duke to break his betrothal and flee to the countryside? Grave enough to sacrifice his reputation and that of an innocent woman?" Adrian's composure shattered completely. He turned away from her, his shoulders rigid with tension. "You don't understand? Then explain it to me." Eleanor's voice cracked with weeks of suppressed emotion. "Explain why you looked at me with such tenderness one evening, only to cast me aside like refuse the next. Explain why you pressed gold into my hands as if I were some tavern wench you'd tired of. Explain why—" "Because I love you." The words exploded from Adrian like a dam bursting, raw and desperate and utterly devastating. He spun to face her, his grey eyes blazing with anguish. "Because I love you more than my own life, and I could not bear to watch you die." The silence that followed was deafening. Eleanor felt as though the ground had shifted beneath her feet, as though the very air had changed its composition. Agatha, with the wisdom of a woman who understood the delicate nature of such moments, quietly excused herself to examine the books on a distant shelf. "The plague," Adrian continued, his voice breaking, "had already claimed 50 lives when I dined with your family. The physicians predicted it would spread through London like wildfire within a fortnight. I had seen the reports, studied the patterns from previous outbreaks. I knew that within weeks the city would become a charnel house." Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. So I destroyed everything between us to ensure you would leave." Adrian's laugh was bitter and self-deprecating. "I told myself it was noble that I was saving you, but the truth is, I was a coward. I couldn't bear to tell you the truth and see fear replace the warmth in your eyes. I couldn't risk that you might choose to stay and face the danger with me." Tears burned Eleanor's eyes as the full magnitude of his sacrifice became clear. "You let me believe you found me wanting. You let me think I had somehow failed to meet your expectations. Better that than to watch you die in my arms," Adrian whispered, his voice raw with pain. "Better to have you hate me and live than love me and perish." Eleanor closed the distance between them in 3 swift steps, her hand rising to cup his cheek. Adrian's eyes fluttered closed at her touch, and she felt him tremble beneath her palm. "You magnificent fool," she breathed. Did it never occur to you that I might have chosen to face that danger with you? That I might have preferred to spend whatever time remained at your side rather than safe and miserable without you? Adrian's eyes opened, and Eleanor saw wonder warring with disbelief in their grey depths. Eleanor, you cannot mean— I mean every word. Her thumb traced the sharp line of his cheekbone, marveling at the way he leaned into her touch, like a man starved for affection. I love you, Adrian Blackwood. Not your title, not your wealth, not your position. You, the man who reads poetry by candlelight, who studies disease patterns to protect people he'll never meet, who sacrificed his own happiness to save mine. For a heartbeat, Adrian simply stared at her as if she were a vision that might vanish at any moment. Then, with a sound that was half sob, half prayer, he pulled her into his arms and kissed her with the desperate passion of a man who had thought himself lost forever. The kiss was everything Eleanor had dreamed of and more, tender yet fierce, reverent yet hungry, filled with weeks of suppressed longing, and the sweet relief of truth finally spoken. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard, their foreheads pressed together as if they could merge their very souls. Marry me, Adrian whispered against her lips, not because of duty or arrangement, but because I cannot imagine drawing another breath without you beside me. Yes, Eleanor breathed, her heart soaring like a bird released from its cage. Yes, 1,000 times yes. From across the room, Agatha's delighted laughter rang out like silver bells. Well, it's about time. I was beginning to think I'd have to lock you both in a closet until you came to your senses. The next few hours passed in a blur of joy and planning. Adrian explained that he had been monitoring the plague's progress from afar, using his network of contacts to track its spread and coordinate relief efforts. The disease had indeed ravaged London, as he had predicted, claiming thousands of lives before finally beginning to abate as winter's cold slowed its transmission. I've been working with physicians to establish better quarantine procedures, Adrian explained as they sat together on the settee, Eleanor's hand clasped firmly in his, and funding research into the disease's causes. If we can understand how it spreads, perhaps we can prevent future outbreaks. Eleanor's heart swelled with pride at his dedication to protecting others, even while he suffered in exile. You've been fighting the plague from here, haven't you? Even while believing you'd lost everything that mattered. Adrian's grip on her hand tightened. Not everything. I still had the knowledge that you were safe. That had to be enough. As evening approached, Agatha insisted that Adrian join them for dinner at Pemberton Manor. We have much to celebrate, she declared, and I refuse to let you skulk about this dreary lodge like some Gothic villain when you could be properly courting my niece. The transformation in Adrian was remarkable. Gone was the haunted, exhausted man who had answered the door that afternoon. In his place sat the Duke of Ravenshollow, in all his magnificent glory, but now Eleanor could see the man beneath the title, the tender heart that beat behind the aristocratic facade. Over dinner, surrounded by Agatha's eclectic circle of friends, Eleanor watched Adrian come alive in ways she had never seen before. He debated philosophy with Mrs. Ashworth, discussed artistic technique with Mr. Fletcher, and engaged in passionate conversation about medical advances with Dr. Thornfield. This was the man she had glimpsed during their first dinner together, brilliant, passionate, fully engaged with the world around him. You know, Dr. Thornfield mused over the final course, there's to be a grand assembly in Bath next week. The first major social gathering since the plague began to recede. Perhaps it's time for certain members of our party to make their return to society. Eleanor felt Adrian tense beside her, and she squeezed his hand reassuringly. What do you think? She asked softly. Are you ready to face the world again? Adrian's grey eyes met hers, and she saw determination replacing the shadows that had haunted them for so long. With you beside me, I believe I can face anything. The assembly in Bath proved to be exactly the stage they needed for their triumphant return. Eleanor entered the grand ballroom on Adrian's arm, her head held high despite the whispers that followed in their wake. She wore a gown of midnight blue silk that complemented her eyes, while diamonds at her throat caught the light like captured stars. But it was the radiant happiness in her expression that truly made her beautiful. Adrian, resplendent in his formal evening wear, commanded the room's attention with his mere presence. But tonight there was something different about him. A warmth in his eyes, a genuine smile that transformed his entire countenance. When he looked at Eleanor, the love between them was so palpable that even the most cynical observers found themselves moved. The evening's most dramatic moment came when Lord Sterling Thorne, a pompous nobleman who had long resented Adrian's influence, approached them with obvious malicious intent. "Your Grace," Sterling drawled, his voice carrying across the nearby conversations. "How unexpected to see you in society again. I had heard you were quite unwell after your recent disappointment." Eleanor felt Adrian's arm tense beneath her hand, but his voice remained perfectly controlled. "Lord Thorne, I trust you've been well during these trying times." Sterling's eyes glittered with spite. "Indeed, though I confess myself puzzled by your presence here tonight. Surely a man who breaks his word so publicly should have the grace to remain in retirement." A hush fell over the nearby guests as they sensed the confrontation brewing. Eleanor felt her own temper flare at the insult to Adrian's honor, but before she could speak, Adrian stepped forward with the quiet confidence of a man who had nothing left to hide. "You speak of broken words, Lord Thorne," Adrian said, his voice carrying clearly through the suddenly silent ballroom. "But sometimes a man must break one promise to keep a greater one. I promised Lady Eleanor's father that I would marry her, but I had already promised God that I would protect her with my life. When those promises came into conflict, I chose love over duty." The crowd stirred with murmurs of surprise and intrigue. Eleanor's heart swelled with pride at Adrian's public declaration, his willingness to expose his vulnerability for all to see. "How very romantic," Sterling sneered. "Though I wonder what Lady Eleanor thinks of being cast aside like yesterday's newspaper, only to be taken up again when convenient." Before Adrian could respond, Eleanor stepped forward, her voice ringing with quiet authority. "Lord Thorne, I think you misunderstand the situation entirely. His Grace did not cast me aside. He saved my life. And now, if you'll excuse us, I believe my fiancé has promised me the next dance." The word fiancé rippled through the crowd like wildfire. Eleanor smiled brilliantly as Adrian led her onto the dance floor, leaving Sterling gaping in their wake. As they moved together in perfect harmony, Eleanor could feel the shift in the room's atmosphere, from scandal and gossip to admiration and romance. "That was magnificently done," Adrian murmured as they waltzed, his eyes never leaving her face. "Though I fear we've just created an entirely new scandal." Eleanor laughed, the sound bright and joyful. "Let them talk. We know the truth, and that's all that matters." As the evening drew to a close, Eleanor found herself surrounded by well-wishers and curious society matrons eager to hear the romantic tale of the Duke who sacrificed everything for love. But through it all, her eyes kept returning to Adrian, who watched her with such adoration that she felt as though she might float away on pure happiness. But as they prepared to leave the assembly, Eleanor noticed a familiar figure lurking near the entrance, a woman whose presence would soon test everything they had rebuilt together. What new challenge awaited them, and would their love prove strong enough to weather whatever storm was coming? The familiar figure by the entrance materialized into sharp focus as Eleanor and Adrian approached the ballroom's grand doors. Lady Charlotte Ashford stood poised like a predator, her golden hair arranged in elaborate curls that caught the chandelier's light, her emerald gown cut to display her considerable assets to maximum advantage. At 24, Charlotte possessed the kind of calculated beauty that came from years of careful cultivation, every gesture practiced, every expression designed for effect. Eleanor's blood chilled as memories flooded back. Charlotte had been her closest friend during their debut season, the daughter of an earl who had always harboured ambitions above her station. More troubling still, Charlotte had made no secret of her fascination with the Duke of Ravenshollow, often speaking of him with a possessive hunger that had made Eleanor uncomfortable even then. "Eleanor, darling!" Charlotte's voice rang out with false sweetness as she glided toward them, her silk skirts rustling like serpent scales. "How absolutely divine to see you looking so recovered from your recent trials." The barb was delivered with surgical precision, designed to remind everyone within earshot of Eleanor's public humiliation. But Eleanor had learned much during her weeks at Pemberton Manor, and she met Charlotte's attack with serene composure. "Charlotte, what a surprise! I had heard you were still in mourning for poor Lord Ashford." Eleanor's tone was perfectly polite, but her words carried their own sting, a reminder that Charlotte's elderly husband had died under somewhat suspicious circumstances just months after their wedding. Charlotte's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Grief is such a private matter, don't you think? Though I confess myself amazed by your own resilience. To appear in public so soon after such a devastating rejection, and with the very man who caused your disgrace. How remarkably bold of you." Adrian stepped forward, his presence radiating controlled danger. "Lady Ashford, I believe you misunderstand the situation entirely. Lady Eleanor was never disgraced, merely temporarily separated from her intended by circumstances beyond our control." "Oh, but your Grace," Charlotte purred, moving closer with predatory grace. "Surely you cannot expect society to believe such a romantic fiction. We all witnessed your very public rejection of poor Eleanor. The entire ton spoke of nothing else for weeks." Eleanor felt Adrian's arm tense beneath her hand, but she squeezed gently, silently communicating her confidence in their bond. She had faced down worse than Charlotte Ashford's petty jealousy. "Indeed they did," Eleanor replied smoothly. "How fortunate that society's attention span is so brief. Already tonight I've heard far more interest in our engagement than in any past misunderstandings." Charlotte's eyes flashed with genuine anger at being so neatly outmaneuvered. "Engagement? How sudden! One might almost think it born of desperation rather than affection." The insult hung in the air like smoke from a discharged pistol. Around them, other guests had begun to notice the tension, conversations dying as curious eyes turned toward the unfolding drama. Eleanor could feel the weight of their attention, the hungry anticipation of scandal that always lurked beneath society's polished surface. But before either Eleanor or Adrian could respond, an unexpected voice cut through the tension like a blade through silk. "Lady Ashford." The voice belonged to Mrs. Cordelia Ashworth, who had appeared at Eleanor's shoulder with the quiet authority of a woman accustomed to command. "How interesting to encounter you here. I was just speaking with Lord Pemberton about your late husband's unusual will. Such fascinating reading, particularly the clauses regarding his suspicions about your fidelity." Charlotte's face went white as parchment. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Mrs. Ashworth clearly possessed information that could destroy Charlotte's carefully constructed reputation. Eleanor felt a surge of gratitude for her aunt's friend, who had stepped into the fray with devastating effectiveness. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean," Charlotte stammered, her composure finally cracking. "Of course not," Mrs. Ashworth replied with a smile that could have frozen champagne. "How silly of me to mention such private matters in public. Perhaps we should discuss it further at a more appropriate time." Charlotte's retreat was swift and complete. With a mumbled excuse about feeling unwell, she fled the ballroom, leaving Eleanor and Adrian standing victorious amid the wreckage of her attempted sabotage. "Remind me never to cross Mrs. Ashworth," Adrian murmured, as they finally made their way to their carriage. "That woman is more dangerous than Napoleon's entire army." Eleanor laughed, the sound bright with relief and triumph. "Aunt Agatha chooses her friends very carefully. I suspect Mrs. Ashworth has been gathering ammunition against Charlotte for quite some time." The carriage ride back to Pemberton Manor passed in comfortable silence. Eleanor's head resting against Adrian's shoulder as they watched the countryside roll past in the moonlight. The evening's confrontation had served to strengthen rather than weaken their bond, proving that together they could face whatever challenges society might throw at them. Over the following days, their engagement became the talk of Bath and beyond. Letters poured in from London, some offering congratulations, others seeking confirmation of the romantic tale that was already growing in the telling. Eleanor found herself amused by how quickly the narrative had shifted. Where once she had been the rejected bride, she was now the heroine of a grand love story. The most significant letter arrived on a grey November morning, bearing the royal seal. Eleanor's hands trembled as she broke the wax, unfolding parchment that bore King Charles II's personal signature. "His Majesty requests our presence at court," she announced to the breakfast table, her voice barely above a whisper. "He wishes to discuss our engagement personally." Adrian set down his coffee cup with deliberate care. "The king has taken an interest in our affairs. That could be either very good or very dangerous." Agatha snorted inelegantly. "Charles has always been a romantic at heart, despite his reputation. I suspect he's more intrigued than offended by your unconventional courtship." The journey to London revealed a city transformed by plague and recovery. Whole districts stood empty, their windows boarded and their streets eerily quiet. But in other areas, life had returned with almost desperate intensity, as if the survivors were determined to celebrate their continued existence. Whitehall Palace buzzed with activity as courtiers and petitioners filled its corridors. Eleanor felt the weight of curious stares as she and Adrian made their way to the royal presence chamber, whispers following in their wake like autumn leaves stirred by wind. King Charles II received them in his private study, a surprisingly intimate space filled with books, scientific instruments, and the comfortable clutter of a man who valued learning above ceremony. At 35, the king possessed the dark, sardonic handsomeness that had made him legendary among the ladies of his court, but his eyes held the wisdom of a man who had survived exile, civil war, and the constant threat of assassination. "Your Grace, Lady Eleanor." The king rose from behind his desk with fluid grace. "How delightful to see you both looking so reconciled." Eleanor curtsied deeply while Adrian bowed, both acutely aware that their future hung in the balance of this royal audience. "Your Majesty honors us with your attention," Adrian replied carefully. Charles waved a dismissive hand. "Nonsense. You've provided the court with its most entertaining gossip in months. A duke who breaks his betrothal to save his beloved from plague, then wins her back through grand romantic gestures. It's better than any play at Drury Lane." Eleanor felt a flutter of hope at the king's amused tone, but she knew better than to relax completely. Charles II was notorious for his unpredictable moods and Byzantine political calculations. "I confess myself curious about the details," the king continued, settling back in his chair with the air of a man preparing to enjoy a good story. "The official reports speak of plague prevention and public safety, but I suspect there's more to the tale." Tut! For the next hour, Eleanor and Adrian found themselves recounting their story in detail, from their first meeting through the painful separation to their joyful reunion. The king listened with genuine interest, occasionally asking pointed questions that revealed his sharp intelligence and political acumen. "Fascinating," Charles mused when they finished. "You sacrificed your reputation to save her life. Then she risked her own reputation to reclaim your love. It's positively biblical in its symmetry." "Your Majesty is most kind," Eleanor ventured, uncertain whether the comparison was meant as praise or criticism. "Kind?" Charles laughed, the sound rich with genuine amusement. "My dear Lady Eleanor, I'm many things, but kind is rarely among them. No, I'm impressed. In an age of arranged marriages and political alliances, you've managed to find something increasingly rare, genuine love." The king rose and moved to the window, gazing out at the Thames with an expression that seemed suddenly melancholy. "Do you know what I envy most about your story? The certainty. You both knew, without question, that you would sacrifice anything for the other's happiness. It's a luxury few of us in positions of power can afford. Eleanor exchanged a glance with Adrian, sensing the deeper currents beneath the king's words. Charles II had never married for love. His various liaisons dictated by politics, convenience, or simple physical attraction. For all his power and privilege, he had never experienced the kind of transformative love that had brought Eleanor and Adrian together. "Your Majesty," Adrian said quietly, "love is not a luxury, but a choice. Even those in positions of great responsibility can choose to honor the heart alongside duty." Charles turned from the window, his dark eyes studying Adrian with new interest. "Spoken like a man who has learned to balance both." "Very well, Your Grace, Lady Eleanor. You have my blessing for your marriage, and more than that, you have my protection. Let any who would question your union remember that the crown itself has sanctioned this love story." The royal blessing transformed everything. Within days of their return to Bath, Eleanor found herself inundated with invitations and congratulations from the very people who had whispered about her disgrace just weeks before. The power of royal approval was absolute in their world, washing away scandal as surely as rain cleansed the air. But more important than society's acceptance was the deepening bond between Eleanor and Adrian themselves. Free from the shadows of secrecy and sacrifice, their love bloomed like flowers after winter's end. They spent long hours walking through Agatha's gardens, talking about everything and nothing, learning the thousand small details that would form the foundation of their shared life. "I want to show you something," Adrian said one crisp December morning, leading Eleanor to a secluded corner of the garden where a small greenhouse stood hidden among the bare branches of sleeping trees. Inside, Eleanor gasped with wonder. The greenhouse was filled with exotic plants and flowers that bloomed despite the winter cold. Orchids from distant lands, roses that defied the season, and delicate ferns that created a miniature jungle in the heart of the English countryside. "I had it built for you," Adrian said softly, his voice uncertain for the first time in weeks. "I remembered how you loved flowers, how you always seemed to brighten when surrounded by growing things. I hoped you might like to have a place where spring could live year-round." Eleanor turned to face him, tears of joy sparkling in her emerald eyes. "It's perfect," she whispered. "It's the most beautiful gift anyone has ever given me." "Not the most beautiful," Adrian replied, pulling her into his arms. "That would be your love, which you gave freely despite every reason to withhold it." Their wedding was set for the first day of spring, a symbolic new beginning that seemed to capture the essence of their journey together. As Eleanor stood in her childhood bedroom at Whitmore House, now returned to London as the plague finally released its grip on the city, she marveled at how completely her life had transformed. Mary bustled about, putting the finishing touches on Eleanor's wedding gown, a creation of ivory silk and Brussels lace that had taken a team of seamstresses 3 months to complete. But it was not the dress that made Eleanor beautiful as she gazed at her reflection. It was the radiant happiness that seemed to emanate from her very soul. "You look like an angel, my lady," Mary breathed, tears of joy streaming down her cheeks. "His Grace is the luckiest man in all of England." Eleanor smiled, thinking of Adrian waiting for her at St. Paul's Cathedral, where they would speak their vows before God and the assembled nobility of England. Tomorrow, she would become the Duchess of Ravenshollow, but more importantly, she would become the wife of the man who had loved her enough to sacrifice everything for her safety. But as she prepared to leave for the cathedral, Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that their greatest challenges still lay ahead. Marriage was just the beginning of their story, and she wondered what trials and triumphs awaited them in the years to come. Would their love prove strong enough to weather whatever storms the future might bring, and what legacy would they build together in the shadow of the crown? 6 months after their wedding, Eleanor stood at the tall windows of Ravenshollow Castle, watching the Yorkshire moors stretch endlessly toward the horizon. The ancient fortress that had intimidated her during her first visit now felt like home, its grey stone walls warmed by love and laughter. Spring had transformed the harsh landscape into a tapestry of green and gold, with wildflowers carpeting the hills like nature's own celebration. The Duchess of Ravenshollow, she still marvelled at the title, had discovered that marriage to Adrian was everything she had dreamed and more. Their love had not diminished with familiarity, but had deepened into something richer and more complex, like wine that improved with age. They had learned each other's rhythms, the small intimacies that bound two souls together, how Adrian's eyes crinkled when he truly smiled, how Eleanor hummed unconsciously when she was content, the way they could communicate entire conversations with a single glance across a crowded room. "Your Grace?" The voice belonged to Mrs. Hartwell, the castle's housekeeper, a formidable woman who had served the Blackwood family for 30 years. "The delegation from the Royal College of Physicians has arrived." Eleanor turned from the window, smoothing her morning dress of deep blue wool. "Thank you, Mrs. Hartwell. Please show them to the library. His Grace and I will join them shortly." The past months had seen Adrian throw himself into his plague research with renewed vigor, using his wealth and influence to fund studies that might prevent future outbreaks. Ravenshollow Castle had become an unlikely center of medical learning, with physicians and natural philosophers arriving regularly to share their findings and debate new theories. Eleanor found Adrian in his study, bent over correspondence from London. Even in the informal setting of their private chambers, he cut an impressive figure, his dark hair slightly dishevelled from running his hands through it, his white shirt open at the throat, revealing the strong column of his neck. The sight of him still made her pulse quicken, even after months of marriage. "The physicians have arrived," she announced, moving to stand behind his chair and placing her hands on his shoulders. "Dr. Thornfield sends word that he's made significant progress with his microscopy studies." Adrian leaned back into her touch, his eyes closing briefly as her fingers worked at the tension in his muscles. "Excellent. If we can understand how the disease spreads at the smallest level, we might develop better prevention methods." Eleanor pressed a kiss to the top of his head, breathing in the familiar scent of sandalwood and ink that always clung to him. "You're going to change the world, you know. Future generations will remember the Duke who helped conquer plague." "We're going to change the world," Adrian corrected, catching her hand and bringing it to his lips. "Your insights have been invaluable to the research. Dr. Thornfield specifically mentioned how your observations about disease patterns in different social classes helped refine his theories." It was true. Eleanor had discovered a passion for the scientific method that surprised even herself. Her sharp mind, freed from the constraints of conventional feminine education, had proven remarkably adept at analyzing data and identifying patterns that others missed. She had become Adrian's true partner in every sense, contributing to his work while pursuing her own interests in natural philosophy. The library at Ravenshollow had been transformed into a meeting hall worthy of the Royal Society itself. Maps covered the walls, marked with coloured pins, indicating disease outbreaks across Europe. Tables groaned under the weight of medical texts, correspondence, and the latest scientific instruments. The assembled physicians, a mix of established practitioners and young innovators, rose as Eleanor and Adrian entered. "Gentlemen," Adrian greeted them with the easy authority that came naturally to him. "Thank you for making the journey to Yorkshire. I trust your travels were comfortable." Dr. Marcus Thornfield, now a regular visitor to the castle, stepped forward with barely contained excitement. Your Grace," he nodded to both Eleanor and Adrian. "I bring news that may revolutionize our understanding of contagion itself." For the next 2 hours, Eleanor found herself immersed in discussions that would have been incomprehensible to her just a year ago. Dr. Thornfield's microscopic studies had revealed tiny organisms in the blood of plague victims, creatures so small they were invisible to the naked eye, yet potentially responsible for the disease's devastating effects. If these animalcules, as Van Leeuwenhoek calls them, are indeed the cause of plague, Eleanor interjected during a pause in the discussion, then our focus should shift from treating symptoms to preventing their transmission, perhaps through improved sanitation and isolation procedures. The room fell silent as the assembled physicians considered her words. Eleanor felt a familiar flutter of nervousness. Even among this progressive group, a woman's scientific opinions were still viewed with skepticism by some. Dr. William Harvey, an elderly physician from Cambridge, stroked his beard thoughtfully. The Duchess raises an intriguing point. If we accept that disease is caused by these microscopic creatures rather than miasma or divine punishment, then prevention becomes a matter of blocking their transmission. Precisely, Adrian said, his voice carrying a note of pride that made Eleanor's heart swell. My wife has proposed establishing a network of isolation hospitals, staffed by trained physicians and supplied with the latest medical equipment. The cost would be substantial, but the potential to save lives would be immeasurable. Dr. Thornfield finished, his eyes bright with enthusiasm. Your Grace, if you could secure funding for such an undertaking, it would represent the greatest advance in public health since the Roman aqueducts. As the meeting continued, Eleanor found her attention drifting to the larger implications of their work. They were not merely studying disease, but challenging the very foundations of how society understood illness and healing. It was revolutionary work, the kind that could reshape the world for generations to come. The afternoon brought unexpected visitors in the form of Eleanor's parents, who arrived at Ravenshollow in a state of barely controlled agitation. Lord Charles and Lady Margaret Whitmore had aged visibly since the plague, their faces bearing the lines of worry and loss that marked so many survivors of that terrible time. Eleanor, my dear, Lady Margaret embraced her daughter with unusual warmth. You look radiant. Marriage clearly agrees with you. Thank you, Mother, you both look well. Eleanor studied her parents' faces, noting the tension beneath their polite smiles. What brings you to Yorkshire? Surely not just a social call. Lord Charles cleared his throat uncomfortably. We've come about Charlotte Ashford. She's been spreading the most vicious rumours about your marriage, claiming that Adrian only wed you out of guilt for his previous rejection. Eleanor felt Adrian stiffen beside her, his jaw tightening with controlled anger. Charlotte's campaign of whispered poison had been ongoing for months, a constant irritation that they had largely chosen to ignore. But apparently, her efforts had escalated. What exactly is she saying? Adrian asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Lady Margaret wrung her hands nervously. She claims to have intimate knowledge of your true feelings, Your Grace. She suggests that your marriage is a sham, that you're merely playing the part of devoted husband while secretly regretting your choice. Eleanor felt a surge of protective fury on Adrian's behalf. Charlotte's jealousy had clearly festered into something truly malicious, threatening not just their reputation, but their happiness itself. And what response do you suggest? Eleanor asked coolly. Shall we dignify her lies with public denials, engage in a war of gossip and innuendo? Actually, Adrian said slowly, a smile beginning to play at the corners of his mouth, I have a better idea. What if we gave society something so compelling to discuss that Charlotte's petty rumours became irrelevant? Eleanor raised an eyebrow, intrigued by the calculating gleam in her husband's eyes. What did you have in mind? A grand ball, here at Ravenshollow. We'll invite everyone who matters, the nobility, the physicians, the natural philosophers, even the king himself if he'll come. We'll showcase our research, demonstrate the importance of our work, and let our genuine happiness speak for itself. The idea was audacious, brilliant, and perfectly suited to Adrian's strategic mind. A grand ball at Ravenshollow would serve multiple purposes. It would demonstrate their united front against Charlotte's rumours, provide a platform for their scientific work, and establish Eleanor firmly as the Duchess of Ravenshollow in the eyes of society. It's perfect, Eleanor breathed, her mind already racing with possibilities. We could arrange demonstrations of the new medical equipment, perhaps even invite some of the patients who've recovered using our improved treatments. Lord Charles looked skeptical. The expense would be enormous, and there's always the risk that Charlotte might attend and cause a scene. Let her come, Adrian said with quiet confidence. I rather hope she does. It will give us the opportunity to address her lies directly, in front of witnesses who matter. The next month passed in a whirlwind of preparation. Ravenshollow Castle was transformed from a comfortable family home into a showcase worthy of royalty. The great hall was cleared and polished until its ancient stones gleamed, while the gardens were manicured to perfection. Eleanor threw herself into the planning with the same intensity she brought to her scientific work, coordinating everything from the menu to the musical entertainment. The guest list read like a who's who of English society. Nobles, physicians, natural philosophers, and court officials all accepted their invitations with enthusiasm. Even King Charles II sent word that he would attend, bringing with him a select group of courtiers and his personal physician. 3 days before the ball, Eleanor received an unexpected letter that made her blood run cold. Charlotte Ashford had not only accepted their invitation, but had written to announce her intention to make a significant revelation during the evening's festivities. She's planning something, Eleanor told Adrian as they walked through the castle gardens in the fading light of evening. Charlotte doesn't make empty threats. Adrian's arm tightened around her waist. Whatever she's planning, we'll face it together. Our love is real, Eleanor. No amount of lies or manipulation can change that. Eleanor leaned into his strength, drawing comfort from his unwavering confidence. I know, but I can't help wondering what weapon she thinks she possesses. Charlotte is many things, but she's not stupid. She wouldn't risk public humiliation unless she believed she had something devastating to reveal. The night of the ball arrived with unseasonable warmth for early autumn, as if nature herself were blessing their endeavor. Eleanor stood before her mirror as Mary put the finishing touches on her appearance, marveling at the transformation. Her gown was a masterpiece of midnight blue silk embroidered with silver threads that caught the light like captured starlight. Diamonds glittered at her throat and wrists, the Ravenshollow family jewels that had been worn by duchesses for generations. "You look like a queen, Your Grace," Mary whispered, tears of pride shining in her eyes. "His Grace won't be able to take his eyes off you." Eleanor smiled, thinking of Adrian waiting for her in the great hall. Whatever challenges the evening might bring, she would face them as the Duchess of Ravenshollow, secure in the knowledge that she had found her place in the world at last. The great hall of Ravenshollow Castle had been transformed into a glittering wonderland. Hundreds of candles cast dancing shadows across the ancient stones, while musicians filled the air with melodies that seemed to make the very walls sing. The cream of English society mingled beneath banners bearing the Blackwood coat of arms, their conversations creating a symphony of cultured voices and gentle laughter. Eleanor descended the grand staircase on Adrian's arm, feeling like a princess from a fairy tale. The assembled guests turned to watch their entrance, and she heard the collective intake of breath that greeted their appearance. They made a striking couple, Adrian magnificent in his formal black evening wear, Eleanor radiant in her midnight blue gown, both of them glowing with the unmistakable happiness of true love. King Charles II himself stepped forward to greet them, resplendent in cloth of gold that emphasized his dark handsomeness. "Your Graces," he said with genuine warmth, "you have outdone yourselves. This gathering rivals anything at Versailles." "Your Majesty honors us with your presence," Eleanor replied, curtsying deeply. "We hope the evening will prove both entertaining and enlightening." The king's eyes twinkled with amusement. "I have no doubt it will be memorable. I understand there may be some dramatic revelations before the night is through." Eleanor felt Adrian tense beside her, but his voice remained perfectly controlled. "Your Majesty is remarkably well informed. We can only hope that truth will prevail over malice." "Do," As the evening progressed, Eleanor found herself in her element, moving gracefully between groups of guests, discussing everything from the latest scientific discoveries to court gossip. The demonstrations of medical equipment were received with fascination, and several prominent physicians expressed interest in funding further research. But throughout it all, Eleanor remained acutely aware of Charlotte Ashford's presence. The widow had arrived fashionably late, dressed in a gown of emerald green that complemented her golden hair and pale skin. She moved through the crowd like a predator stalking prey, her smile never quite reaching her calculating eyes. The confrontation came, as Eleanor had known it would, during the evening's musical entertainment. As a renowned soprano performed an aria from the latest Italian opera, Charlotte rose from her seat and moved to the center of the hall with the confidence of someone who held all the cards. "Your Majesties, your Graces, distinguished guests," Charlotte's voice carried clearly through the sudden silence. "I hope you will forgive the interruption, but I feel compelled to share some information that may be of interest to this assembled company." Eleanor felt her heart begin to race, but she kept her expression serene as all eyes turned toward Charlotte. Whatever revelation was coming, she would meet it with dignity. "We have all heard the romantic tale of the Duke and Duchess of Ravenshollow," Charlotte continued, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "A love story for the ages, we're told, but I wonder, how romantic would it seem if you knew the truth about their courtship?" The hall was so quiet that Eleanor could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. Beside her, Adrian's hand found hers, his fingers intertwining with her own in a gesture of solidarity. "You see," Charlotte went on, clearly savoring her moment of power, "I have in my possession certain letters that reveal the Duke's true feelings about his marriage. Letters that speak not of love, but of duty and pity." Eleanor's blood turned to ice. Letters? What letters could Charlotte possibly possess? But even as the question formed in her mind, she saw the answer in Adrian's suddenly pale face. He knew exactly what Charlotte was talking about. "Perhaps His Grace would care to explain," Charlotte purred, producing a folded piece of parchment from her reticule, "why he wrote to his closest friend describing his bride as a burden I must bear for the sake of honor." The words hit Eleanor like physical blows, each syllable driving deeper into her heart. Around them, the assembled guests stirred with shock and fascination, the romantic fairy tale crumbling before their eyes. But as Eleanor looked into Adrian's anguished face, she saw not guilt, but desperate love, and suddenly she understood. Whatever those letters contained, whatever words Charlotte was about to read, they had been written during the darkest period of Adrian's self-imposed exile, when he had believed himself unworthy of love and happiness. "Read them," Eleanor said clearly, her voice carrying through the stunned silence. "Read every word, Lady Ashford. Let this company hear exactly what my husband wrote during the worst period of his life." Charlotte's eyes widened with surprise at Eleanor's unexpected response. But she recovered quickly, unfolding the letter with theatrical flourish. "My dear Pemberton," she began, her voice ringing with triumph, "I write to you from the depths of despair, knowing that I have destroyed the one thing in this world that brought me joy. Eleanor Whitmore was everything I could have desired in a wife, intelligent, beautiful, kind, yet I cast her aside like refuse. Now I am trapped by honor into marrying her, knowing that she can never truly forgive my cruelty. She will be a burden I must bear for the sake of honor, a constant reminder of my own unworthiness. I pray that time will dull the pain of knowing I have ruined both our lives in my cowardice." The silence that followed was deafening. Eleanor could feel the weight of hundreds of eyes upon her, waiting to see how she would respond to this public humiliation. But instead of shame or anger, she felt only a profound sadness for the man who had tortured himself with such self-loathing. "Is that all?" Eleanor asked calmly, stepping forward to face Charlotte directly. "Is that the great revelation that was supposed to destroy our marriage?" Charlotte's confidence wavered slightly. Surely you cannot dismiss such evidence of his true feelings. Evidence of his feelings 6 months ago, Eleanor interrupted, her voice growing stronger with each word. Evidence of a man so consumed with guilt and self-hatred that he could not believe himself worthy of love. Evidence of the very pain that brought us together in the end. She turned to face the assembled guests, her chin raised with quiet dignity. Yes, my husband wrote those words. During the darkest period of his life, when he believed he had destroyed everything good between us, but those words do not represent the truth of our marriage. They represent the lies he told himself when he thought love was beyond his reach. Eleanor moved to Adrian's side, taking his hand in both of hers. The man who wrote that letter was broken, consumed with guilt over choices he made to save my life. The man I married is whole, healed by the power of forgiveness and the courage to accept love when it was offered freely. She looked directly at Charlotte, her emerald eyes blazing with quiet fire. You thought to shame us with evidence of past pain, but instead you have given us the opportunity to show this company what true love looks like. Not the fairy tale romance of poets, but the real, difficult, transformative love that can heal even the deepest wounds. The hall erupted in applause, the sound washing over Eleanor like a benediction. She saw tears in many eyes, including those of King Charles himself, who stepped forward with obvious emotion. "Your Grace," the king said, his voice thick with feeling, "you have just demonstrated why love stories like yours become legend, not because they are perfect, but because they are true." Charlotte stood frozen in the center of the hall, her moment of triumph transformed into crushing defeat. The letter that was supposed to destroy Eleanor had instead become a testament to the power of redemption and forgiveness. With a strangled sob, she fled the hall, leaving behind only the echo of her humiliation. As the evening drew to a close, Eleanor found herself surrounded by well-wishers and admirers, but her attention remained focused on Adrian. He had been quiet since Charlotte's revelation, his face shadowed with old pain despite their public triumph. "Walk with me," she whispered, leading him out onto the castle's battlements where they could be alone beneath the star-filled sky. "I'm sorry," Adrian said finally, his voice raw with emotion. "I'm sorry you had to hear those words, sorry that my weakness was exposed for all to see." Eleanor turned to face him, her hands framing his beloved face. Those words were not weakness, they were honesty. The honesty of a man who had lost hope, who could not believe that love might triumph over guilt and fear. But they were true, Eleanor. At the time, I did see our marriage as a burden, a penance I had to pay for my cruelty to you. "And now?" Eleanor asked softly. "What do you see now?" Adrian's hands covered hers, his grey eyes shining with unshed tears. "Now I see the greatest gift I have ever received. A love so pure and generous that it transformed my very soul. A woman who saw past my failures to the man I could become." Eleanor smiled, her heart overflowing with joy. Then Charlotte's revelation was a blessing in disguise. It allowed us to show the world, and ourselves, just how far we've traveled from those dark days. As they stood together on the ancient battlements, surrounded by the Yorkshire moors that had become their kingdom, Eleanor reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. From the golden cage of her privileged youth to the public humiliation of rejection, from the healing sanctuary of Agatha's manor to the triumph of true love, every step had been necessary to forge the bond that now united them. "What are you thinking?" Adrian asked, following her gaze across the moonlit landscape. "I'm thinking about seeds," Eleanor replied with a smile. "How they must be buried in darkness before they can bloom in the light. How the most beautiful flowers often grow from the richest soil, soil enriched by decay and loss and pain." Adrian's arms encircled her, pulling her close against his chest. "And what have we grown from our rich soil of pain?" Eleanor leaned into his embrace, feeling the steady beat of his heart against her cheek. Something beautiful, something lasting. something that will bloom for generations to come. In the months that followed, their prediction proved prophetic. The research conducted at Ravenshollow Castle led to breakthrough treatments that saved countless lives during subsequent disease outbreaks. Eleanor's insights into public health became the foundation for reforms that transformed medical care throughout England. Their love story, tested by scandal and strengthened by truth, became a beacon of hope for others who dared to choose love over convention. But perhaps most importantly, they had learned that true happiness came not from avoiding life's storms, but from weathering them together, hand in hand, heart to heart, until the sun broke through the clouds and revealed the rainbow that had been waiting all along. As Eleanor stood once again at the windows of Ravenshollow Castle, now heavy with their first child, she smiled at the sight of Adrian in the gardens below, tending to the roses they had planted together. Their love had indeed bloomed where it was planted, growing stronger and more beautiful with each passing season, a testament to the power of choosing hope over fear, forgiveness over resentment, and love over everything else the world might offer. The Duke had paid her to leave the city and never return, secretly saving her from a plague he knew was coming. But in the end, it was Eleanor who had saved them both, not from disease, but from the far more dangerous plague of loneliness that had threatened to consume their hearts forever. If this tale of love conquering all has touched your heart, I invite you to share it with others who believe in the power of true love. Subscribe to hear more stories of courage, sacrifice, and the triumph of the human spirit. And please, leave a comment telling me which moment in Eleanor and Adrian's journey moved you most. I read every single one and treasure your thoughts. Until our next story together, may you find the courage to choose love, even when the world seems determined to tear it apart.